So last year we had Nosferatu, this year we have Frankenstein. Monster movies are so back, baby. We are so back. So Frankenstein is the most recent Netflix exclusive, directed by Guillermo Del Toro, starring Oscar Isaac, Mia Goth, Christoph Waltz, and others. It's a retelling of the age-old story by Mary Shelley, in which you have this brilliant, egotistical scientist, Victor Frankenstein, who goes on to create a monster that ends up being both of their own undoing. A classic tale that explores so many themes such as humanity, life and death, what it means to create, what it means to be created. So many themes that resonate today that have been redone in books, movies. It was so ahead of its time, that's why this is a classic. The movie starts off with a cool little chase scene in the Arctic in which you have the creature chasing after Victor Frankenstein. Kind of John Wickish, honestly, a lot more action-based than I thought it was going to be. The opening scene of this film was really cool. But once the creature catches up to Victor, they start telling each other stories, and this movie is told through a series of flashbacks, basically broken up into 4 acts. So the movie starts off when Victor is very young, then shows us the process leading up to the creation of the creature, then tells us the tale from his perspective and then the creature's perspective. One of the biggest positives and compliments I can give to this film is I think for being such a long movie, almost 2.5 hours long, it does flow pretty naturally. There's not a whole lot of holdup in the acts, and the acts, the way they're structured themselves, as I'll get into in just a sec, I think are pretty good to push this story and narrative along, because it is an enormous book. There's a lot of source material, a lot of it is very dry, so if it was told and structured in a different way, you would be sleeping from minute 1. But this movie, more so than just traditional scenes, is kind of broken up into little montages. It's very fast-paced within the scenes, which I really enjoyed. I didn't need to sit and watch characters stand around and talk in Old English. There are some scenes that are standard, but for the most part, a lot of this movie felt like it was a bunch of miniature montages within one giant scene. And this is also Guillermo Del Toro at his best if you are a fan of his direction, because this movie is absolutely massive and it's also beautiful. This is a movie I'm glad they brought to movie theaters so you can go see it limited time. Looks absolutely gorgeous. I really like the score here as well. Kind of Tim Burton-y, to be honest, kind of old school Disney's the vibe it was putting off to me. And where I kind of personally prefer a darker score to these types of old age period pieces, I did really enjoy the throwback score to this film that made me kind of feel like I was in a Goosebumps episode. So when you pair those two things together, the score with the visuals of this film, you get exactly what you'd expect from a Guillermo del Toro masterpiece, where you have this giant world, awesome score, very gothic aesthetic to it, contrast of colors, black, white, reds, really pops on screen. I think this is a gorgeous movie to look at if that's your type of thing. Also, I think you have a couple of really good performances here. You have Oscar Isaac as Victor Frankenstein. I think he's really good in this, by far the best part. If you can get over the fact the first time you see him, he is shirtless with a six-pack, kind of stands out for a mad scientist, but who am I to judge? But he carries a lot of this movie on his shoulders because he's the main character, obviously telling the story of the scientist. And I think he's really well cast. I'm not really super familiar with his work in the past, but I think he was perfectly cast in this film. I think he kind of nails all of the elements you need to portray this egotistical yet kind of genius scientist that we kind of have to root for, but we also know is super flawed. Kind of sad to say everybody else aside from that, I don't really think is too special because they're not really too centric to the story. Being the gigantic Mia Goth fanboy I am, I was really disappointed she was not really in this movie that much. And I also just enjoyed the themes this movie is tackling, the duality of man, what life and death means to each of us. You have Victor Frankenstein, who becomes fascinated with death so much he wants to create life out of it after losing his mother. And then to the contrary, you have this creature he creates who is basically obsessed with dying because he does not believe he needs to be created. And these are clearly themes that the story of Frankenstein has become known for, but I really liked how this movie portrayed Victor in particular. It's a guy who is a creator at heart. He loses himself so much trying to create that he completely forgets what it means to preserve and nurture and things like that after the life has actually been created. I like that humanity element this movie tries to talk about. And sticking with that subject, I like how this movie tackles the contrast of religion and science. Again, this is during a simpler time where a lot of people are more religious, so they're not okay with the fact that this guy is so ingrained in science. But just asking the questions of what it means when you contrast themes of religion with creation of another human being. You know, what does it mean to be a god? What does it mean to be all-powerful? What does it mean to create, be a creator? This movie introduces those questions, again, very central to what Frankenstein is. But getting into my negatives with this film, I have a way of saying Guillermo del Toro makes beautifully boring films sometimes. I wouldn't say this film is boring overall, but I think there were large sections of this movie that kind of frustrated me because the movie would kind of constantly bounce back and forth between something I really enjoyed and something that was just frustrating me and kind of teasing me, putting me to sleep. There were large sections of this film I thought were pretty good, and then I would go through this low where I was starting to get bored and the tempo was kind of dying, and I was just like, what are we doing? Where are we going with this? And right when I thought I was going to check out, it gave me a nugget of something I really enjoyed, and I bought back in. I kind of bounced like that back and forth the entire time I watched this film, bouncing between greatness and just slop that bored me. There was no in between. That was how this entire movie was structured. Off, on, off, on. And it really frustrated me because I think when you take the good elements of this film and you just amass them together, you have a fantastic, awesome film. But I cannot neglect the moments of this film I felt kind of bored and I thought were just repetitive. This is almost a 2.5-hour film. Does not need to be. Which kind of awkwardly brings me to my next point. I almost feel like this movie would have been better as a TV show. This movie is kind of awkwardly long and drawn out at points, incredibly slow, but at the same time, it feels kind of fast-paced and rushed, which doesn't make any sense, the ultimate oxymoron. Because this movie is trying to jam so many themes into the film. As I said, it's kind of structured in the 4 acts, and that's only hinting at other portions of the Frankenstein story, like the fact that he wants a mate. But because the movie is trying to jam so many things into the same film so quickly, you never really get to sit and simmer with the humanity elements. Sure, there are a couple of moments, but it felt like every time you get to that giant moment of payoff with a balloon burst, it just ended and it had to fit so much more stuff into it. It just had to keep going. I just wish this movie would have given me a little bit of time to breathe with the themes, because I think when you get to a couple of the moments, they're fantastic. You just don't get them for long enough. This movie also utilizes a lot of CGI, and I'll be honest, there's some super gnarly kills associated with it. People getting thrown across the room, showcasing the strength of the monster. There's a lot of good stuff they do with it, but it also kind of took me out of the film because almost everything related to gore, action in this film is CGI. Whereas you contrast Nosferatu, that movie felt, when you're watching it at least, incredibly practical almost entirely. I don't want to say this movie feels cheap, but it feels kind of sloppy. Kind of took me out of all of the major moments because even though the kills are cool, you have this super old school gothic environment with clear CGI thrown into it. Also, just being honest, I was not really a huge fan of the monster's design choice in this film. He felt way too human-like for me. Sure, he's a hodgepodge of human body parts and whatever the story says, but he doesn't really look like that. He just looked like a guy wearing a suit. It's a very generic practical effects CGI and special effects makeup. It didn't look like anything that would actually be the composition of body parts, which again, kind of paired with the CGI, took me out of the immersion of this world because it's this giant world-building epic of Frankenstein, and it just felt kind of Disney-like, as I said. I feel like this movie, for being 2.5 hours long and having so many major moments that are supposed to pay off emotions, I really didn't feel anything in this movie. I thought it was incredibly hollow. This is a problem I run into with a lot of Guillermo Del Toro films, and sometimes they grow on me the more I watch them. Same thing I had with Crimson Peak, where I call that movie the beautiful sleep remedy. Not to get sidetracked, but I feel like there was actually a large section of this film filmed at the house where Crimson Peak takes place. Let me know in the comments down below if you thought the same thing, that stairwell. But yeah, as I was saying, this movie felt hollow to me. Like, I never cared about any of the characters in this film, with the exception of one scene related to an old man in the forest. I thought that entire segment with the creature and him during his tale, loved every part of it. If the entire movie would have been that makeup of the old man and the creature, that tone, that payoff, I think this movie would have been fantastic. But unfortunately for me, that was not the case with most of the scenes. So a lot of the major deaths and reveals and the conversations where you're supposed to really be tugging at the heartstrings didn't feel a whole lot. And then finally, and most importantly, I'm just not fanatical about the Frankenstein source material. I wasn't really into the book back in the day. I've seen Penny Dreadful, about a dozen renditions. None of them have really won me over and made me say, wow, a masterful Frankenstein movie. Like, it doesn't really hit for me. Is this a bad film? Definitely not, but it's something that would have had to be exceptional to win me over. It's probably one of, if not the best renditions of Frankenstein, I will say that. That being said, I'm definitely never watching this movie again, so take that with a grain of salt. I do put a lot of stock kind of when I do ratings and whether or not I would rewatch something, how digestible it is, and this is a movie one-timer for me by far. But overall, because I do love historical horror and the fact that we are finally getting monster movies again, I didn't have the worst time with this one. I had a pretty good time. Like, comment, subscribe, join me down below. As always, I will see you in the next review. Peace.